Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 30 best episodes of Star Trek Enterprise. So in this video I will count down my personal favorite 30 episodes of Star Trek Enterprise. So this video is a continuation or conclusion of my coverage of Star Trek Enterprise, where I covered every season of Star Trek Enterprise. I covered every single episode, one season at a time. I did a video for each season, or 2 videos for season 3, as it stands. And so I'm just wrapping up that conclusion by covering my personal favorite 30 episodes after just watching the show. Now, one thing I gotta make very clear for those who maybe just clicked on this video not familiar with my channel: this video is to celebrate my coverage of Star Trek Enterprise, and thus I'm going to talk for as long as I feel like. So if you were like, oh my god, it's a 2-hour video, why are you rambling so long? You should make it more succinct. No, that's the whole purpose of this video, is to ramble as long as I freaking feel like. If you want a more succinct version, I do have a top 10 Enterprise video on my channel, which I think is like 15 minutes long or something, and there's plenty of others you can find on the internet. If you don't want something that's really long, then this is not the video for you. But if you want to celebrate with me coverage of Star Trek Enterprise, then here we go. Anyway, as if you're familiar with my channel, if you watch my review, my coverage of Enterprise, you know that's probably is my least favorite of all the Star Trek shows. Although, I don't know, it's hard to say, because I really dislike the first 2 seasons, but I love seasons 3 and 4. So I am kind of split on Enterprise, but overall the premise and the way it's set up, might have to say it's my least favorite, but I still enjoy the show. I still can't get over that damn theme song. I think that right there makes it my least favorite. But there's a lot of good episodes I did like. Now, unlike my top 15 worst episodes of Star Trek Enterprise, which that countdown featured exclusively episodes from season 1 and 2, my 30 best isn't just going to be exclusively season 3 and 4 episodes. I actually am going to have episodes in it from all 4 seasons, although 3 and 4 do dominate. I gotta say, as it should be. But they're, season 1 and 2 aren't neglected entirely. Also, this was a bit of a quandary for me, because season 4 in particular had a lot of 3-parters. And there's other, 2-parters and whatnot, in season 3 is quite serialized. So I made a rule, and this is what sets it apart from the other top 10 I did for Enterprise, because I didn't follow this rule, is that I made a rule that if there was a 3-parter or any sort of continuation that went beyond 2 parts, I counted each episode separately. So I still took the 2-parters, especially the ones that was a clear 2-parter, which was part 1 and 2. I still count that as one episode, like Stormfront or Shockwave, and stuff like that. Which is a clear 2-parter. I count that, or Demons, or actually I don't know if I count that as 1 and 2. But anyway, clear 2-parters I count as one episode. But other episodes that aren't so clear, and particularly the 3-parters, anything beyond 2 parts, I count each episode separately. So that will sort of affect, I think it changes my top 10 a lot, because I end up having a lot of different parts from the same series. But whatever. It's what I decided to do. This is what I'm sticking to. Now, as I always do when I do one of these top 10s, I rate every episode between 1 and 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. And so I grouped these episodes together with the rating I gave it, so flash up on your screen here right before I get into that set that I all rated that certain number. Now, Enterprise actually starts at my 7 rated episodes, and most of the countdowns I do, like I did 50 for Voyager, I did 30 for Babylon 5, I did 50 for Deep Space Nine. most of them pretty much start in 8. And I think Deep Space Nine definitely started deep into the 8s, and the majority of the top 50 was comprised of 9 rated episodes and 10 rated episodes. Voyager, I think, had like 3 7 rated episodes, but then went straight to 8. I can't remember. Babylon 5, I'm pretty sure, started around 8, maybe had a couple from 7. Enterprise has quite a few from 7, so I guess it shows that doesn't have as much good episodes as the other shows that do have to fall back a bit, and it doesn't have the higher rated episodes. But the higher rated episodes are still good. So anyway, let me get started and get into my top 30 best episodes of Star Trek Enterprise. Alright, let's start with my number 30 favorite episode of Enterprise, and that is Future Tense, the Season 2 episode. Now, this episode was pretty intense. Yeah, whatever. Not the best thing ever. It felt like a lot of these Temporal Cold War earlier seasons episodes felt like an X-Files episode. I think this one more so than the others because it was very mysterious about what's going on. It's like a lot of things happen, but nothing really happened, and they don't really explain ever anything that's really going on in this episode. But it's still really cool. Like, it features the first time the Tholians appear in Enterprise, although we don't see their alien form in this episode. We do see their ships. And it's a very intense chase scene where the Tholians, the Suliban, everyone's chasing after this futuristic ship that Enterprise has, and they all want them to give it up. And of course, Archer doesn't want to give it up because it could reveal all these secrets. And it has like the body is like descendant from all these different alien races, like humans, Vulcans, a whole bunch of them never heard of, and this is very odd for the humans of this time period to see, but kind of makes sense, thinking that's from the 29th century. But one thing I really love about this episode is how, because up to in season 1 and 2 is a very huge trope, and they use this trope so many times, where they're like being chased by someone or someone's being hostile and they're like, oh, we can't handle this, so we got to get to the Vulcans. We got to run, take the ship to the Vulcans, and the Vulcans are going to save us. And it happened a lot. And usually, not all the time, but usually they do get to the Vulcans, and the Vulcans, kick the other ship's ass and they're safe. So the Vulcans are always their safety net. And what I love about this episode that I thought did so good was they did that again. They're like, oh, we got to get to the Vulcans because they're being chased by the Suliban and the Tholians. And so at one point, like, the Suliban get all over their ass and they're like attacking the ship and the ship's falling apart. And like, we got to get to the Vulcans. So like racing at high warp, to get away from the Suliban to get to the Vulcans. And the stakes are high. The Sulibans are attacking the ship. The ship's about to be destroyed. And finally they get to the Vulcans. And the Vulcan ship is fucked. It's on fire. It's damaged. It can't move because the Tholians got there first and fucked it up. And so they're trapped between two enemies, the Suliban behind them and the Tholians ahead of them. And they're like, holy fuck. And eventually, like, the Tholians start kicking the Suliban's ass. So it shows how much of a badass, how formidable the Tholians are, which I love. So eventually, like, it buys them some time because the Tholians leave Enterprise alone. They kick the shit out of the Suliban, but they know that the time's going to run out because once the Tholians kick the Suliban's ass, then they're going to turn around and attack them. So that's when they, put the homing beacon that lets the time travelers get the ship back into the future, so the Tholians are no longer interested in them. They never really did explain why the Tholians were interested in this future ship or how they even knew about it, and how the Suliban, they don't explain anything. But it's still a really intense episode that I really like. Anyway, let me get into my number 29, which is Stormfront. This is the two-part premiere of first episode of opens up season 4. It takes a cliffhanger from season 3 that a lot of people hated and thought was ridiculous, that all of a sudden Archer ends up in some hanging out with Nazis in the 40s, and there's some aliens hanging out with Nazis, and I think it does a really good job of taking that really bad, let's just call it what it is, cliffhanger, and doing something interesting with it, turning something interesting out with it, and making it about an alternate history where Germany did team up with these aliens in order to start winning the war, and they took over the east coast of the United States, and basically they're winning World War II, and the Allies are kind of fucked. It's kind of like The Man in the High Castle that takes place like years after the Axis powers won World War II, where this takes place right during World War II, but while Germany, the Axis powers, are going to win, like they're winning. It's almost a foregone conclusion, and they invaded the United States. So that's pretty intense, and of course they tie it into the whole Temporal Cold War storyline, and saying that the Temporal Cold War turned into a hot war, and that's why all these different factions are fucking with the timeline, and that's why this one faction fucked with it and made the Nazi win. But the villains actually weren't the ones who did this. They don't care. They're just using this as a stage for their evil plans or whatever, but they're the ones who start the whole hot war, so they're the ones that need to be stopped. And of course you got Silic sneaking around. He teams up with Archer to actually take on these aliens, which is cool. And you get the death of Silic, and you basically wrap up the whole Temporal Cold War storyline, so we don't have to deal with it anymore. Which it was kind of hastily wrapped up, but I actually prefer that they wrap it up rather than not address it at all. So at least that's something. But the episode itself, pretty interesting, pretty good stuff. So yeah, that's my number 29. So now let's get into my number 28, which is the Augments. So this is getting into one of those 3-parters in season 4. This, I believe, is the 3rd part, I want to say, of the Augment trilogy. And it is, one of the lowest rated of the trilogy. Because, the 3rd is interesting. The 3rd part was definitely interesting. Definitely wrapped up the whole storyline of the Augments trying to start a war between the Federation and Klingons so they can get away, because, of course, the humans don't like the existence of the Augments and want to arrest them, or not arrest them, but keep them confined, which is something that they don't want to get because, Starfleet thinks they're dangerous. And they prove them right. It's what I like about this, that soon he was, for the first 2 parts, was helping the Augments and fighting against them. But here in this part, he realizes that Starfleet's actually right about them. That as much as Soon wanted them to be wrong about them, they were actually right. That they are dangerous and power hungry, and some of the good ones are killed by some of the bad ones who, because the power lust wins out. So that was quite intense, and of course Soon eventually turns and helps Archer, and at first Archer is very dubious about this, but it turns out to be right, and it's of course big stakes where he's trying to start a war with the Federation and Klingons. Or it's not Federation, sorry. This is Enterprise, it only exists yet. With Starfleet. With Starfleet and the Klingons. So, that's really good stuff. Anyway, let me then get into my number 27, which is Proving Ground. So this is a great Season 3 episode. We get Shran in Season 3, which I think was pretty good to include him. That he, it's maybe a bit far-fetched the Andorians followed the Enterprise all the way into this Expanse, but of course it makes more sense. Like at first, Shran is like, oh, we just want to help you, you're friends. And I wouldn't buy that at all. I'm surprised Archer did, although I think Archer was a bit dubious about that explanation too, but he just went along with it. But when they actually did explain that no, it's not because he wanted to help Enterprise, it's because Andorians ordered them to go in and steal this Xindi weapon so they could use it for themselves, which makes a lot more sense. So because of that, I totally do buy this storyline. And I think, yeah, I love Shran as a character. He's a really interesting character, and I love how, because most of season 3, the Zindi story arc, leaves behind most of the other storylines and characters of the first 2 seasons, which I don't mind, to be fair. But Shran is one from the first 2 seasons who actually was a really great character. So I love their decision to actually include Shran in this storyline and make it because Caval appears in Twilight, but that's like alternate reality BS. Here it's actually Shran, and it actually counts for things going forward, and will have consequences for the story later on when Shran appears at the very end to help fight the Zindi, helped Starfleet fight off the Zindi, which I think was great because I love how, and of course in this episode, Shran betrays Archer, and he feels bad about it, but he's orders to do so he's a good soldier, so he has to do what he's ordered. And I love the battle wits, because Archer figures out he's being betrayed, and he finds the way to sort of screw Shran over and get to the weapon he's trying to steal to self-destruct. And, Shran thinks he's bluffing, and Archer's like, you better get rid of that weapon, it's going to blow up. And he's not bluffing. And I love that. That's so great. And even though Shran, was bested by Archer, doesn't really, instead of holding a grudge, he kind of understands where Archer's coming from, and then he takes it upon himself to help Archer and defend Earth against the Zindi later on, as I said. Towards the end of the season, which I think is really well earned. So I love the really adversarial but friendly adversarial friendship, I'll put it that way, that Archer and Shran have, and I think this is a really good showcase of that. So, anywho, let's get into my number 26, which is Shockwave. Now, it might shock you that Shockwave is only number 26, because when I did the top 10 Enterprise episode 5 years ago, however long it was, this was in my top 10. But, full disclosure, when I did that top 10, I hadn't actually seen the actual episode for many years, and I was just going off of memory. But now I have seen them watch it recently, and it's fresh in my mind. And as much as I do love Shockwave Part 1, which I do still think is a great episode, probably one of the best of Season 1, which, as I said, was not a good season. So the fact they had a good episode in that season was great. But then I rewatched Episode 2, Part 2 of Shockwave, the premiere of Season 2, and I found that actually does drag the 2-parter down. And I am counting this as one episode, so because of that, I had to take into account that the second part, not very good. So it kind of drags it down. Whereas otherwise, Part 1 was great, because there's a whole thing where Enterprise thought that they destroyed this whole colony because they fucked up a simple procedure, but then they found out it was just a Suliban fucking with them, and Starfleet recalled the Enterprise because of this. And so it was a huge shocking moment when Daniels appeared and told them, actually no, the Sulibans fucked with you, you didn't do anything wrong. So they were and Daniels gave them the weapons and technology to go in there. They just went in and kicked the Sulibans' ass and got the information they needed. Love that. That was such a great scene to see all the tables turn. Now, Part 2 I didn't totally hate. I did think it was pretty intense with the Suliban holding Enterprise captive, and they all had to do their great escape, dun 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 dun, to escape out of their rooms. And of course, the show has to find a way for sex appeal, so they find a way for Hershey to lose her shirt. But it was still pretty intense, pretty interesting conclusion. Although there's a lot of issues I have with the second part, why is Caval still wanting to scrap Starfleet when he has hard evidence that that it wasn't fucking Enterprise? That doesn't make any sense. I don't buy that. And Archer being the future, I'm pretty sure the original plan was to reveal who Future Guy was and all that, but they didn't do any of that. I think they're cowards for not doing that. And Archer being the future was just boring, really. But the first part was so amazing, and there were good aspects to the second part, so that's why it makes it as high as it does. Alright, so next let's get into my number 25, which is The Expanse. Not one of my favorite TV shows, as you see in the poster behind me, but the second season finale of Enterprise. This is, of course, the episode that kicked off the Xindi story arc in Season 3, so how much I love the Xindi story arc, and yes, you're going to hear a lot more about that later on. But this was mainly just a setup episode, and it did have this sort of sidebar with Duras hunting Archer, which I thought was a bit annoying and kind of a distraction. But the main analogy, the 9/11 analogy they were going for, was quite powerful and quite effective. How this weapon just appears out of nowhere and wipes out I think it was 3 million people on Earth, and Trip's sister. It's one of the ones who died, and how it affected him. I think the interplay they did with him, how much I don't like this character, but what they did with him in this episode, and basically all of Season 3, was really great stuff. It was really powerful the way he was like denying it, didn't want to talk about it, and trying to deny it, and is just filled with hate and revenge. And of course, how the whole sort of human race was in mourning. And not just that, because they found out that this, not only were 3 million people killed in this attack, they found out that they have pretty good authority that the race who did that is trying to wipe out humanity for good. They want to destroy Earth. And of course, that typical Vulcans being assholes and being, oh, we're not going to help you, blah, 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 blah. And Archer, which I don't like, but I like how Archer puts them in this place and like, no, screw you. We're not going to stay behind and let Earth be destroyed. We're going to go out. And they're like, oh, we don't support this mission. And they try to stop T'Pol from going, but T'Pol goes anyway because she's formed this bond with Archer. And I love that. I think that was all good stuff. And I think it was a very intense setup. The only reason it doesn't rank higher is because the Duras stuff was a bit annoying and distraction. But anyway, so next we'll get into my number 24, which is Cold Station 12. So this is second part of the Augments trilogy. I did enjoy this one a bit more than the third part because it was a really intense sort of hostage situation storyline where they have the Augments take over the station where they're trying to get a hold of all the embryos of all the Augments, and you got Dr. Lucas, who's Phlox's friend, is trapped there, held hostage, and Archer tries to take a team and infiltrate the station and get the better of them. But I love how he fails, because it shows that the Augments do have superior intellect and superior at strategizing, and they see him coming. They easily defeat him. They outsmart him, and then they use them to get what they want from Dr. Lucas, mainly by threatening to torture Phlox. And of course, soon is starting to see the Augments' true colors. Particularly Malik, who is proving himself to be a egotistical, power-hungry villain. And I think they pull it off well. I don't think he comes off as two-dimensional. He just comes off as power-hungry and ruthless. And I think it makes sense. And it proves home the whole theme of the Augments trilogy is that superior intellect and superior power breeds, and superior strength breeds superior ambition. And I think they do a great job of driving this home, and how Malkath tried to kill the Enterprise crew without Soon's permission, how they even got this like retrovirus. So it was a very intense episode, and ends on a cliffhanger too, where they think that they're all going to die. Of course, it's resolved very quickly in part 3, but it was still very, very good stuff. So we'll then get to my number 23, which is Dear Doctor. So I'm including a season 1 episode, and this is quite a controversial episode. Some people hate this episode, and some people love it. I actually really like this episode. Now, it has to do with the origins of the Prime Directive, and there's a lot of... More modern times, I never remember this being around in the 90s, but modern times there's a lot of backlash against the Prime Directive. A lot of people are very much against it and don't like it for certain reasons. And I think there are extreme cases portrayed in Star Trek which I don't particularly agree with, but I'm still with the general idea of the Prime Directive. Now, there's also been arguments up against this episode not understanding how evolution works. I'm willing to go with it because I'm willing to suspend disbelief because I think it does pose a really interesting moral question. And even though maybe the moral question, the way they pose it's not entirely scientifically accurate or valid, I still think it's an interesting character dilemma. And I love how Archer's sort of faced with it. And of course, Phlox wants Archer to withhold this medicine from this alien race that's dying because there's another sub-race that's being sort of suppressed by this main alien race and they can't flourish while the alien race is dying, which I think it's an interesting dilemma. And I talked about this in my review of this episode, how some people say that Archer committed genocide, which is total nonsense because he didn't kill anyone, he just withheld medicine. And that's something, and it's also an interesting thing for him because that's something the Vulcans would do. And so he hates the Vulcans, piss them off, oh, these assholes are withholding information or technology from us, but he's put in that situation where he can empathize with them. And I thought that was a really great character beat for Archer. And plus, like the way this whole episode explores Phlox through his narration, his strange alien cultures, and it has this Ensign Cutler, who's a great character, should have appeared more in the show, but sadly the actress who portrayed her passed away. If she hadn't, I'm sure we would have seen more of her. She had a bit of a crush on Phlox, which I thought this was all interesting. I thought it was a really good character story, one of the better moments of season 1 in my opinion. So anyway, as you know, I'm not a fan of season 1. But anyway, let's move on to my number 22, which is The Forgotten. And this is a season 3 episode. It's more of a quiet, downbeat episode. It's not like all intense like some of the season 3 episodes are. It's more of taking a breath. I think there's a couple of side plots in this storyline, I can't remember off the top of my head, that I maybe wasn't that big on. I didn't think were the best thing ever, but it was interesting. Trip's journey, because he's being an asshole and showing so much hatred to Degra because of Zendi, who sent the weapon that killed 3 million people on Earth, including his sister. But he goes on the journey where he comes to realize that Degra deeply regrets what he did. Not only that, he is their best hope for saving humanity, and he wants to save humanity to make up for his past mistakes. And Archer keeps trying to tell Trip stop being an asshole to him because we need his help. And Trip comes to realize this on his own through having to write a letter to the family of someone who was in his team that passed away, and how he keeps seeing visions of her. So it's actually a really touching episode. Now, I did sort of mention before that we didn't get many episodes that we started in my 7 range for this top 30, but we're at number 21 and we're already up to my 9 range. So I guess I just didn't have that many 8 rated episodes. So it's still to Enterprise's credit that we're already at my 9 range at number 21. But anyway, let me get to my number 21, which is Anomaly. This is another season 3 episode. has to deal with pirates trying to attack Enterprise. When it's most vulnerable, it's kind of still setting up the Expanse in this indie story arc, and setting up the anomalies where Enterprise is completely unprepared for them, and of course they start to become prepared. It's really interesting because it reminded me of the Voyager episode The Void, which is one of my favorite Voyager episodes, how these alien raiders just came in, took all their shit when they were in this vulnerable position with all these anomalies fucking with them. And it's basically the same thing that happens here, but the outcome is a bit different because the situation is different. Because there was a whole bunch of ships, and Voyager was able to like form this alliance with some of these ships, where it's not really the situation here, where Enterprise more of ambushes them and gets the better of them and starts like attacking them and getting their shit back. He basically tortures. Archer ends up torturing a prisoner, that they call it, for information, which is the first along the way of a dark path Archer will go on. Although in this case he kind of holds back a bit. Reed sort of, it shows like how much he's changed because of all of humanity at stake. So I thought it was a very good character set for that. Like the time that Reed was saying, "Oh, sir, you can't do this," and Archer's like, "Fuck you, I'm going to do it anyway." And this, by the way, much better when Voyager tried to do an Equinox, which Janeway went too far in that episode, where here, what Archer does makes it, he doesn't go too far. He still tries to hold on to what makes him human, like he says. But that will change later on, and I'll get to that later on. So anyway, let's get to my number 20, which is Stratagem. So this is another season 3 episode. I think this is an underrated episode. I really enjoyed this episode, where it's kind of reminds me of the Next Generation episode Future Imperfect, because it's like it starts out presenting it as if this is some like future timeline, but you find out it's all hoax. I kind of predicted early on that it wasn't, but I love it because it was Archer who was putting on the hoax, and it was all about him trying to trick this information out of Degra, because he knew that he didn't even bother with torture because he knew that wouldn't work, which is smart of him, and he knew that Degra wouldn't give up the information that he needed to have about where the Xindi weapon was, so he tricked it out of him. And this is a very clever episode, and he does it by trying to pretend to be his friend, and of course this would kind of come back to haunt him later on when he generally does try to be Degra's friend. Degra's like, "Yeah, remember that time you really tricked me and deceived me? Haha, didn't really like that." Not the best way to form a friendship. But it's still really interesting, and still how, because when Degra figures out that this future timeline is just nonsense, and Archer comes up with another trick, and of course the audience isn't aware, but I thought that was a really nice reveal, because he was saying, "Oh, we found some way to do some really fast hyperdrive to go to this place. We found out where it is," and but although they didn't know that they weren't sure. Like they thought maybe that Azadi Prime was the place, but they weren't 100% sure, and it would take them like months to get there. So they faked this like hyperdrive, and then Degra starts freaking out, and he gives away, "You'll never find the weapon," and gives away that it was the place. That's great. I love that. I think this is a really good episode. Anyway, let me move on to my number 19, which is Carpenter Street. Of course, the name of the episode is an homage to John Carpenter. And I think this episode, I don't know if I put this, I didn't, but I should have put this in my series of episode everyone else hates that I love. I don't think everyone else hates this episode, but they look on it a lot more sort of poorly than I did. And this is another episode that was in my top 10 before. It's kind of dropped again. Maybe partly because of the format I'm doing, but also because maybe I still love this episode, but maybe realize it's not quite as top 10 material. But I think it's a really dark tone, because it's about Archer and T'Pol traveling back to 2004 and to find this like junkie. I don't think he's a junkie, but he's a very shady, despicable individual who's got a good actor. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but a very good actor I've seen in other movies and stuff. He's been in Voyager and whatnot. Playing this really shady character who's like kidnapping people for the Xindi so the Xindi can do tests on this episode. This is inspired by John Carpenter, but to me it had more like a CSI feel to it. But regardless, it's a much darker, more of a horror type feel than I've ever seen in Star Trek. I know Star Trek has done certain episodes that are horror-esque, like Genesis or whatnot, but that's different than this. This felt, because that was always horror in the vein of Star Trek, where this felt like a more modern, more like a hard R, even though it's not hard R, but it felt like a more modern, adult, creepy horror. It wasn't even horror, it was more like a thriller. And I think that makes it really unique. And I think they really hit the tone right. I love, of course, they have some hijinks with Archer and T'Pol dealing with 21st century technology and whatnot. But throughout, even through the humor, there was a really dark undertone to this whole episode that gave you this really creepy feel, which I actually think they sold. Although I will say, seeing the Xindi in the 20th century or the 21st century did kind of show to me how fucking ridiculous those outfits are, the costumes are. I'm sorry, I love season 3 of Enterprise, but whoever designed those costumes for the Xindi, it's a bit cheesy and over the top, let's just say. But other than that, really creepy, effective episode that I really loved. Anyway, we'll get to my number 18, which is getting back into Season 2 again. As I said, I'm showing Season 2 some love. Let's talk about Regeneration. Number 18, which I think is such a great episode because it's the only appearance of the Borg in Enterprise. And when I first heard they were doing a Borg episode in Enterprise, I'm like, oh my god, this is going to be so stupid, because like the whole point of Enterprise is that they wouldn't have to deal with these 24th century, because it's set in a totally different time period. So it's before they met all these alien races. And they did this once with the Ferengi, who the humans were not supposed to meet this early, and it ended up being a total disaster, as you know from my previous worst video. But so I kind of thought, oh god, they're doing this again with the Borg, and also, Voyager ruined the Borg and went overboard with the Borg, and I was like, no, not the Borg again. You're just gonna fuck it up. And I was shocked that they did such a good job, because not only does it make sense canonical, unlike some of that crap in Voyager like Dark Frontier, which makes no sense canonical, but not only does it fit perfectly into canon, because they use the thing of first contact, and it ties into the whole Zephyr Cochrane thing, and it makes perfect sense. And also, like, the Borg never say they're the Borg, they never say we are the Borg, and that's part because nobody knows who the Borg are at this stage. And you might think, well, the Borg would be able to kick the fuck out of Enterprise's ass, because that's just a primitive 22nd century ship. But the Borg don't have a Borg ship. They have to deal with 22nd century technology, and that's why. But even then, they are able to advance it, and it creates a really effective ticking clock method in this episode, because the Borg technology, as they keep doing improvements to this 22nd century technology, it keeps going up and up and up and up, where eventually their technology will far exceed Enterprise, where they'll be able to not just outrun them, but kick their fucking ass. And I love that. It makes it super intense and gives this ticking clock now. They treat this assimilation nanoprobes more like a virus than has ever been done before with the Borg, so that's a little bit out of place, but it's not too bad. It doesn't quite fit with how they've been established before, but it makes for a very intense storyline, with Phlox being infected with the nanoprobes and trying to find a cure. And funny enough, he does find a cure way back in the 2nd century. It's never mentioned. 22nd century is never mentioned again, but whatever. Maybe he got lost in time. But still, like, yeah, this is really well written episode. Like from start to finish, like the pace of it goes at a perfect pace. It is intense the whole time. It is suspenseful. It's your edge of the seat stuff, and as I say, they find ways to make it creepy in a very effective way. So this is one of the few cases I will say that the second season actually did something right. They actually hit the tone, and it shocked the hell out of me that they actually made a Borg episode good. I was expecting it to be a disaster. But as I said, part of the reason why I love it is because it's the only appearance of the Borg, because I think it works as a standalone one and done. That's it with the Borg. It would have sucked if the Enterprise tried to keep bringing the Borg back. And I hear that they had plans to do it in season 5. Even as much as I loved the idea of season 5, wanted to see season 5, I'm so glad that never happened. But who knows? I could have been shocked, and then maybe they would have surprised me like this episode surprised me to actually be good. But since it was going to feature the origins of the Borg Queen, I fucking doubt it. Anyway, because fuck the Borg Queen. Anyway, sorry. Let me move on to my number 17, In a Mirror Darkly. Now, yes, another two-parter that was in my original top 10. Not quite top 10. Again, probably more to do with the change of format. And watching this episode again, I do realize it's maybe not quite top 10 worthy because it is somewhat ridiculous. Like, I think the ending with Hoshi Sato taking over and like, I'm Empress Sato. I was like, you double cross, a triple cross, a quadruple cross, or whatever. And who the hell is Hoshi? And it's just like, that was a bit too much for me. And I also was bothered by the fact that Forrest was the captain throughout the first part. And like, who's Forrest? He's some side character. Why is he the captain? Archer should be the captain. But this is such a fun episode. This was the writers, like, just really fanboying out. And I love that. This is the kind of thing most of the previous Star Treks would never be allowed to do by the production team, producers, Rick Berman, and people like that. Although I hear Rick Berman kind of lost all control by season 4, which is probably part of the reason why season 4 is so good. And so, like, they just fanboyed out. They had the Gorn, they had the Tholians. They said, oh, this is what happened to that ship that was in Tholian's web, the Defiant. Oh, it reappeared in this parallel, in the mirror universe in the past, and the parallel version of Archer finds them. And I love how they didn't even bother to try to tie it back to the main, our main prime timeline, because that, of course, would fuck with canon, because it's been established Mirror is the first encounter. Although Discovery now is the first encounter, but that was kind of off the books. But I'm not here to talk about Discovery. So it doesn't. So it keeps that canonical thing by having there's no interaction. It's just entirely set in the Mirror universe, which I think was a bold move. I think it really paid off, and I think they did a great thing to show like the Vulcans and the other minor races and how they're sort of realize how fucked up the Terran Empire is and want to strike back, and how the humans see these other alien races as lesser. I also got to talk about that intro to the first part, which I think is like the best thing ever, when they showed First Contact and they changed it to have like Zephyr Cochrane shoot the Vulcan. I mean, that was really inspired stuff. I mean, it's over the top, but in a very, very good way. And also, I almost said, like, this should be my number 1 on my countdown by default, because it's the only 2 episodes in the whole entire show that don't have that shitty theme song. When they had, like, the different intro that had, like, the, you know, instead of showing all the space exploration, it shows, like, war, and it has that intense music, da-da-da-da, like, I was having so many nerdgasms. I was like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever, it's the best thing ever, it's the best thing ever. So really, I should have it as my number 1 for default, for not having that horrible theme song. But I'm not going to do that, because it is, as much as I love it, it is a bit silly. I mean, some of the actors they were really hamming it up, like they knew there was just over the top silliness. I love Scott Bakula in particular gives a really hammy performance, which I kind of like. Yeah, I kind of like, but it does make it. I can't really take this episode too seriously because of it. The bridge is yours, Captain. Like, that's good stuff. Anyway, let me go ahead and get into my number 16, which is Home, an episode I really come to appreciate. It's, well, technically the third episode of season 4, because Stormfront dealt with, Enterprise was never able to return home after the Xindi arc because Stormfront happened when they went back in time. We finally got back, so Home deals with the aftermath. And I said this before, I think this is a better episode than Family. Family, of course, is the Next Generation episode that dealt with the aftermath, the best of both worlds. I think this one's better. I think this does a better job of dealing with the aftermath of the Xindi story and the effect that it had on Archer's character. Like, he is suffering from PTSD in this episode, and it makes sense. And more to it, he hates himself for all the horrible things that he's done. I mean, it's kind of like I'll get to the episode Damaged later. But it's kind of like it shows how doing these horrible things affected his character and how it eats at his conscience. That's something that Deep Space Nine never did with Cisco and In the Pale Moonlight, because In the Pale Moonlight was never referenced again. The terrible shit that Cisco had to do to save the Federation. But here, they show what a toll all that evil shit that Archer had to do in order to save humanity, what a toll that had on him, and how guilty he feels of all the people who died on there. Like, basically a third of his crew died on this mission. And I love how they acknowledge that, and I love how that weighs on his soul. And it's such a great, they introduced Captain Hernandez in this episode, who's such a great companion for Archer. Like, everything about the season 4 is looking better. Now, the trip into T'Pol's storyline where they go to Vulcan, T'Pol has to marry that one dude. Not the best thing ever, but it's not bad enough to bring this whole episode down. Even though I'm not a huge fan of that storyline, it didn't totally suck. It was okay. And he had a third plot with Phlox, like, freaking out and they were being aliened in the discrimination, which, again, totally makes sense in the context of the whole story. And this is something I think Enterprise does so well, is keep with continuity and show the consequences that earlier episode has on the rest of the show, and I love it. I think this episode is a really great character story. Okay, so next let's get into my number 15, which is Fallen Hero. Yes, another rare appearance from season 1 in my countdown. This is I think I called this the best episode of season 1. Very surprising me how much I love this episode, because it was a good character story for T'Pol, because she saw this Vulcan ambassador as a hero, and she's going away disgraced, and it's sort of fucking with her worldview. But then we find out there's actually more to it, that she's not really disgraced, they're just putting on an act because they're trying to get her away from this plan because these rogue factions are trying to kill her. And then going through that journey and her realizing this, it was actually really well written, and it was really well acted, and it was a great character story. But what I love most about this episode is the chase scene that they had at the end, which was one of the most intense things. Now, I talked earlier about the whole cliche of we gotta get to the Vulcans, and this is another case of it, but this was a good case of it. I think this is used very well, because Archer knew that he couldn't get to the Vulcans in time, so he found ways to, like, stall them, and they, like, fake the ambassador's death and stuff like that, and by the time they figured it out, it was too late, and the Vulcans showed up and they were screwed. Which I love. I love Archer in this episode. I thought for most of the first season he was a bit of an incompetent dummy, but here he actually is a pretty good captain. So it's one of the rare cases that season 1 actually used him correctly, that he was able to outwit these aliens. And there was such an intense, like, chase scene too, how they were pushing the engine to the limit, and he's like, Archer's telling Trip, well, it is called a Warp 5 engine. He's like, yeah, in theory, but not practically, the ship's gonna fall apart. And how they, like, were racing, the other ships were, like, burning their engines to catch them. It was a really intense chase scene. So this is a good episode. Got to admit, one of the rare cases where season 1 really did something right. Anywho, let me get into my number 14, which is United, and I might as well roll this into my number 13 as well, which is Babylon 1. Because these are the first two parts of a three-parter. Because it's a three-parter, I had to consider it separately, but basically I just lumped them together. Number 14 and number 13 on my list, because this, of course, is the three-part trilogy about the Tellarites and the Andorians going to this pizza summit on Enterprise, but the Romulans send this ship that can disguise itself as other ships to fuck with them and make the other ones think they're attacking each other, so war's going to break out. And of course, no one knows it's the Romulans, and I love that. And I think it's kind of setting up for a season 5 Romulan story arc, which of course never happened because season 5 never happened. But it was still really good. You had the personal story with Shran, where his loved one gets killed and he wants revenge, and Archer knows that if he does get his revenge, it'll fuck with the treaty. So Archer does it himself and fights Shran and cuts off his antenna, and somehow that honors it, which I think is a bit far-fetched. But whatever, it was still really intense episode. And of course, Reed and Trip get caught on this weird ship that's able to cloak itself, and you find out that it's being controlled remotely from Romulus, and so the people try to fucking kill them and fuck with the ship, and that was all really intense and good. Third part you will not find on my countdown because it was okay, but I did think it was a bit boring, and it definitely felt like an afterthought. I think maybe this would have worked better as just a two-parter, but whatever. Still a really good episode. Alright, so next we'll get into my number 12, which is Similitude. Okay, I'm sorry. Whenever I talk about this episode, I do kind of have to bring up that other really crappy Voyager episode that totally sucks that a lot of people love for some odd reason, because I'm talking about Tuvix, of course. Because that episode sucked. Tuvix I'm talking about. Because it tried to do this moral dilemma and it failed in every way, and it just didn't know if it was supposed to be comedy or drama, and then it turned into a ridiculous, over-the-top melodrama, and it didn't really drive its point home. Similitude does this because a lot of people might say, oh, Similitude's just copying Tuvix. Actually, no. It's doing the storyline right. It's succeeding where Tuvix failed. It tells the actual moral dilemma, and it actually does it correctly this time, because it has an actual situation where Archer actually wants to kill someone rather than just put two halves, or take one half and separate them back to their two original forms, which is what Janeway did. I'm not getting into this again. But anyway, Archer actually has this serious dilemma, because you had this clone of Trip that's only lived for 5 days, but he figured out a way to expand his lifespan to have a normal human life. And the original plan was just to harvest the organs to save Trip's life, and then let the clone live out his normal lifespan. But then Phlox figured out there's been more complications, and there's no way to save Trip without completely taking Sim's organs, which will kill him. It's great. We have a great moral dilemma, and it's because, again, this is another thing that will haunt Archer later on, because he has to order Sim to be killed because he needs his engineer in order to save humanity. And it's such a hard decision for him, but I love how Sim himself realizes, he has the chance to run away, but he realizes, where would he go? What would he do? What would his life be like? It shows the instincts of survival, but then him realizing that he should sacrifice himself for the greater good. And it's really heartfelt. It's really well acted, really well written. As I said, this moral dilemma actually done justice. Anyway, let me get into my number 11, which is The Forge. So, The Forge is the first part of the Vulcan three-parter, which I'll get to the other two parts later. It's really interesting. Like, it sets the stage for what's going on. I don't think it was quite, 10 rated material. It was almost there. It was very close. Because it is mainly just a setup episode. It's setting up that, it starts out pretty intense with Admiral Forrest being killed, an explosion. It's again yet another 9/11 analogy, but it's really intense. But it turns into, I'll get into what it turns into later. But it's really interesting because the Vulcans are being assholes like they always are, and they're being shady. They're trying to block Archer and T'Pol from investigating, but they go anyway, and they have to face this really desert, and it's interesting seeing stuff with Vulcan. And it's really interesting that Ambassador Caval actually started coming on their side and was all on Archer's side and helped Trip actively to investigate this and find out what really happened, which I think is saving his character and saving the Vulcans. So yeah, really good episode. Alright, so now we get into my 10 rated episodes, and we get into my top 10. I think this is the first time this ever happened to me in any of these countdown videos where my 10 rated episodes just so happen to correspond perfectly with my top 10. So my top 10 are my 10 rated episodes. There you go. Pretty good stuff, interesting that way. Anyway, let's start with my top 10, or my number 10, sorry, which is Azadi Prime. Now, I started to think that maybe this episode was a bit overrated. Now, I talked about this in my full-length review. I saw this episode completely out of context. I already saw like most of Season 3 before I saw this episode, and I'm pretty sure I would have appreciated this episode a lot more had I actually saw it in context. But watching it again recently, I realized that it's actually a lot better than I gave it credit for, because we'll talk about the episode that comes after, which I actually love a lot more, and I think this episode gets a lot more of the praise and the notice and the fan, prestige and people saying it's a good episode. So I'm kind of jealous of this episode because I think the one that comes after deserves more accolades that it doesn't get. But and that's kind of what maybe made me sort of look down on this episode. Oh, it's a bit overrated. It's not as good as everyone says it is. But when I watch the episode for my, reviews, and I keep an open mind, try to be really objective and analytical, I do see this as actually is a really good episode in its own right. Because, of course, they've been building up this, because I talked about Azadi Prime and Stratagem, which was like 4 episodes again. So they've been building up with Azadi Prime for a long time. So people unfamiliar with Enterprise don't know what the hell this episode title means, like with Azadi Prime. But if you're watching Season 3 at the time, what this means. This is what you've been waiting for. I can't wait for them to get to Azadi Prime, because they've been building this up so much. It's that kind of serialized storytelling that I love. But this episode in particular, of course, is a great character story for Archer, because he, as I said, this is even before he did some of the more shady stuff. Like, he does worse stuff. But even the stuff he's done so far, such as torturing those pirates and killing Similitude, that's weighed so much on his mind and the people that he lost that he was willing to sacrifice himself. Even when it wasn't fully necessary. Like, he could have sent someone else. Everyone else is saying that, but he felt so guilty he didn't want to send anyone else to die, that he felt he needed to face the consequences, so he was willing to sacrifice himself to destroy this Xindi weapon. And then Daniels appears, of course, and says, "Don't do this," because he knows he's important to the future. And he tries to show him, like, the Xindis are part of the Federation. The Xindis are humans, are friends in the future, and they're being manipulated by these fear builders, which I do think is the introduction, although it's hinted at in the previous episodes. It's really the introduction of the storyline of the sphere builders being the real villains behind what's going on with Earth. They're just using the Xindi as pawns. And Archer, of course, not hearing that, he doesn't care. He just ignores that until his mission fails and he gets captured by the Xindi, and that's kind of his fallback. But actually, and I think Daegor and one of the Xindis call him out on this too. They're like, "Oh, well, you're all friendly with us now, but it's only because your mission to destroy us failed." And they're right. They do have him there, but it's also a character growth for him that he has to realize that peace is the way to go. And of course, what really makes this episode great is that ending where the Enterprise is fucked. I mean, totally fucked, because not only do they capture Archer, but they find the ship and they send like a fleet of Xindi ships that way more than the Enterprise can handle, and they get their fucking ass kicked. And that was and it ends on that cliffhanger with the whole ship like blowing up and tearing apart. Like, that was one of the most intense cliffhangers. I think it's probably right behind Best of Both Worlds. That's how intense I think that cliffhanger is. So I do, after seeing that, it's like, okay, I definitely do see why this episode is so loved. I mean, as I said, I watched it out of context, so I already knew what happened after this. But when you first watched this episode, when it first aired, for those who did, there was like a 3-month or at least 2-month gap before. So this was like a mid-season finale where people are left wondering, and they leave them with a shot of Enterprise getting the ever-loving shit kicked out of it. So that was actually really good, really intense. So gotta give this episode some credit for that. Anyway, we'll get into my number 9, which is the Observer Effect. I do still really much love this episode. It was one of the few standalone episodes of season 4, and it references the Organians from the original series. But this is an earlier version of them where they're kind of prime directive, and they're not supposed to interfere. Like, they just observe, and they look to this planet that has a really deadly virus, and they just observe how all these aliens go there and die. And it shows how kind of twisted it is, but they try to be like, oh, we're so benevolent and above and everything. And I think it's a really good prequel to the Organians. I think because when we do see the Organians in the original series, they do interfere, but they hate. They're like, oh, we really hate to interfere. Like, we really don't want to. We find it disgusting to interfere in the matters of you primitives, but we feel we have no choice. And this shows that sort of evolution, because at this stage they don't want to, and they don't, until someone has to speak up, like the dude impersonating Mayweather, and be like, no, we do fucking have to interfere. And of course Archer gives this heartfelt like speech, like, oh, you can learn from humanity, something about compassion, blah blah. That stuff I love. But the whole episode is really creepy. It's interesting because the Organians were shown in such a different light in the original series, but it's interesting they used it for such a dark tone, creepy episode where you have the Organians inhabiting Reed and Mayweather, while like people around them are, Trip and Hoshi are dying, and there's a situation they're just really all detached and being blah 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 blah, and speaking just very scientifically and detached, while like Archer's desperately to save him. Of course, Archer like sacrificed himself to try to save him. Like, super emotional, very powerful episode. All right. So now, let me get into my number 8, which is Cogenitor. So, yes, I did mention before that this was my favorite episode of the first 2 seasons. So it is weird for a second season episode to make it so high. in my countdown, but it's one that, yeah, it is my favorite episode of the first 2 seasons, and this is one of the rare cases where I do think season 2 got it right, really right. Again, this is another episode that's kind of controversial. Some people kind of disagree with the message. I explained the message more in my review. I personally think that some people kind of misunderstand what this episode is trying to get at. It's not trying to say that cultural differences excuses all kinds of behavior. What it's trying to say is that you should understand more of the cultural context when you're dealing with a totally different culture before just running in and trying to be the hero and interfere with things you don't fully understand. You need to kind of understand what's going on. So it's not trying to excuse like the discrimination that's going on in this alien culture, but it's trying to say that his Trip's instinct to, let me rescue this person, actually just ended up fucking things up and making things worse. That you do have to go about it the smart way. You can recognize an injustice and discrimination, but you have to be smart about it. If you just go in and try to be the hero, you end up fucking things up. And I think that's an amazing message. And I think the way this episode plays it out is so good because it's showing, like, you're on Trip's side for most of the episode. You think he's doing such a right thing. You think he's doing such a good thing by helping this character, the co-genitor learn and become a better person, even when the rest of the species just treats him like property. But the results in the co-genitor killing themselves. And it kind of just disrupts relations between humans and this other alien race because Trip just jumped in. And this is, as I said, like Trip in a lot of the first 2 seasons, most of the show to be honest, is a bit of a moron. He just runs in all hot-headedly, and usually I think that's horrible. But for this episode, I think it actually really works because it shows the consequences of doing that, of not thinking ahead and not being more familiar with cultures. It's a literal alien culture. He literally knows nothing about it. This is another thing that's really great because a lot of Star Trek, particularly the older Star Trek, will treat alien cultures just like human culture, but this shows it's completely alien, and I think it's a very powerful episode. Anywho, let me get into my number 7, which is Twilight. So this is a number 1 on a lot of top 10 Enterprise lists. I don't know if I wouldn't put it up at number 1. Obviously, it's my number 7. But it's still a really damn good episode. It's a lot of people, often described it as Memento meets yesterday's Enterprise, which is basically what it is, because it shows an alternate timeline where Archer loses his short-term memory, he loses the ability to gain new memory. So he loses his short-term memory, and every 10 minutes he loses any memories. He remembers anything that happened before the accident, but everything after he completely forgets after 5 minutes. Just like Memento. And which is one of my favorite movies, by the way. And of course, they use that to play out this alternative timeline where Earth is destroyed, and humans are living on City Alpha 4, or is it 5, or I don't know which one they're living in, but they said it's ironic because I think it was City Alpha 5. City Alpha 6, maybe. It's the one that's destroyed. Because it's ironic, because the place they chose as their home is the one that's going to be destroyed in the future. As we know from Star Trek 2. But anyway, really good storyline. In the same vein of yesterday's Enterprise. Where it shows this really dark future and to see, like, to have the teaser be seeing Xindi just destroy Earth. Like, that is one intense teaser. Gotta say, maybe the most intense. And also, really hammers home the stakes in the Xindi story arc, which is really easy to figure because, the heroes are going to prevail, blah, blah, blah. But to see this, fuck that. Earth is gone. Of course, it's reset by the end of the episode, which I don't mind, to be clear. But it really, because it hammers home the stakes in the season 3 story arc. And of course, it has a really good character story between T'Pol and Archer. How T'Pol is having to care and look after him all these decades because she felt guilty. She felt it was her fault that this happened to him in the first place. And of course, to have that revolution, you have that huge Xindi battle with the Xindi are taking over the Enterprise and they're all getting destroyed. And at the last second, they managed to reset the timeline. I love that. I'm a sucker for that. It's always good stuff. So, let's get into my number 6, which is 0 Hour. So this is the final episode of the Xindi story arc in Season 3, which I absolutely love. It was such an intense, one of the best action episodes in all of Star Trek, I'll just say. Because, as I said, the stakes were really high. They firmly established the Xindi characters in the whole arc. So it felt real. And this, I already mentioned how Shran shows up at the last second to help Enterprise fight him off. Well, it's not Enterprise, Archer, because Enterprise is elsewhere. Because you got the other intense scene where Enterprise is trying to destroy the spheres in order to save the Xindi and the other Expanse, which is part of the deal. And you have the sphere builders like going in, traveling through walls and being transparent and just fucking things up and trying to destroy the ship, while the Enterprise crew are like have the space is affecting them and they're got shit all over their faces and they're like ready to die. Like super intense. And of course the stakes are Earth is about to be destroyed. Like I said in Twilight, we saw this happen in Twilight. We see the Xindi weapon approach Earth. It's gonna fucking happen. And there's just 2 ships fighting themselves, and Archer like barely manages to destroy it at the last second, which is super intense. The final scene, of course, as I said, the cliffhangers kind of sucked, but other than that, really good episode. Alright, so now let me get to my number 5, which is Countdown. So, Countdown is the episode that comes right before 0 Hour. I did think it was a bit better, slightly better than 0 Hour, because it didn't have that over-the-top ending. But it was really intense. This was continuing off of the Council, where they killed Degra and the reptilians are going off to kill Earth, and it really has this really strong ticking clock throughout most of the episode, and of course Archer makes friends with the rest of the with the other Xindi that are still alive, the other primates, and they try to team up to go after the reptilians. And of course Major Hayes dies rescuing Hoshi, which is a really emotionally powerful scene, particularly when Reed has to tell the other Makos, like, Hayes died, but I need, we need your help. We need volunteers to go rescue, go to Earth to save Earth, and everyone volunteers. This is one of the few cases they do that cliche that I totally buy, because I thought this episode was so good. Alright, so then, now let me get into my number 4, which is Awakenings. So this is part 2 of the Vulcan 3-parter in Season 4. This is when we learned that Archer is carrying the Katra of Sarek, which is a pretty interesting concept. And as I said, because it takes this device that was introduced in Star Trek 3 as an excuse to bring Spock back to life, but it does something interesting with it, and it takes a historical figure, and it kind of makes logical sense. And of course, they realize that this terrorist group that they think is responsible for the bombing aren't terrorists at all. They're in fact peaceful. And it's really interesting, the conflict, because T'Pol's mother is part of them and she doesn't like it. And T'Pol, who's the leader of this group, is not being very friendly and wants to strip the Katra out of Archer, and T'Pol's very much against it because she thinks Archer could die. And T'Pol's like, no, you're misunderstanding me here. I'm not giving you a choice. We're fucking doing this. And Archer's like, fine, let's do it. But then, of course, Sarek doesn't want to leave and they're like, oh, why the hell is Sarek choosing to stay in the stupid human? But Sarek is purposely staying in the human because he's an outsider, and the Vulcans are too corrupt with with the culture the way it is, which is all interesting stuff. And then, of course, you learn on board, like Trip is trying to rescue Archer, and he keeps getting attacked by the Vulcans, and he learns that it's all a ruse so they can attack the Andorians. So, very intense episode, indeed. So now let me get to my number 3, which is the next episode in this trilogy, Kirshara. So this I did think was the best, most intense of the Vulcan, which I love the whole Vulcan trilogy. Partly because by the end of this episode they fixed the Vulcan problem, because that was a main issue I had with seasons 1 and 2, that the Vulcans were assholes when they shouldn't be assholes. But here they make it more resemble what the Vulcans should be, and it explains it. It says, okay, this is why, because there was corrupt politicians in charge, but now we kicked them out, and this is what the new Vulcan, who's more friendly towards humans, will be like. Now, some people use that as an excuse to justify how they were assholes in season 1 and 2, but I don't think it's an excuse. I think it's a retcon. It's a retcon that needed to happen, but they definitely weren't planning for this all along, as Manny Coder came in as producer and corrected the mistakes of Brennan Braga and Rick Berman, who kind of sucked. But, off topic, they do it in such a really intense way. It's a very fantasy-esque storyline with Archer having this magical, well, it's not magical, but this ancient artifact that will bring peace to Vulcan. And he has the thing of Sirach, so he's acting very much like a fantasy character, like he has the faith and whatever, and he knows what to do. But I think it works. It works very well. It's a very effective story. And then, of course, you have the other storyline, which I can't believe more people can't see how this is a very obvious analogy to the Iraq War, which was going on at the time that this episode aired back in 2005, about how the corrupt Vulcan politician wanted to use the excuse that the Andorians had weapons of mass destruction when clearly they did not. He was lying about it. He knew full well they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. He just wanted to use it as an excuse to start a war so he could gain power. I mean, that's very clear Iraq War analogy, and it shows how despicable this Vulcan politician is. And I love when he gets comeuppance when all the Vulcans turn on him, when they realize how fucked up he is. Of course, you find out he was working for the Romulans all along, which makes a lot of sense. So really, really, really good episode. Absolutely love it. Alright, so now let me get into my number 2 second favorite episode of Star Trek Enterprise, and that is The Council. So this is the third to last episode of season 3, that one that comes right before Countdown and 0 Hour. And I think it's the best of those 3, because even though it might not be as action-packed or intense, I think it's a lot more character-based, and there's a lot more dialogue and character interactions, really great acting, very great script writing. And I actually do think it is, even though there's not a lot of action, fighting, and ships shooting at each other, it is super intense. It's really intense, and I think, as I always say, it's more impressive to me when episodes of shows or movies can be more intense and suspenseful just through dialogue. To me, I always find that more impressive. And here we get the whole situation where Archer's trying to convince the Xindi Council to stop their attack on Earth, and the reptilians, of course, are very much against it. So you had this outburst in the council, and the Hushi's trying to translate for them, and you had the reptilians like say, "Oh yeah, we want to hear the humans. We'll listen out," but they're just deceiving them because they want to portray them. And then the fucking reptilian dude kills Degra, which came out of nowhere. I mean, this is amazing stuff. Really, really, really good stuff. Some of the best of all of Star Trek, in my opinion. Alright, so as you can see, like the Xindi story arc at the end of season 3 and the Vulcan 3-parter, since I had to split it up all into each one episode, because my other top 10 I counted it all as one, but since I split it up into 3 different episodes, it kind of dominates the top 10. Kind of the result of that, but that's just how it goes, because I love those story arcs so much. But now we'll get to my number 1, which is actually outside of those. Well, it's part of the whole season 3 story arc, but it's outside of those direct story arcs. And that is my number one favorite episode of Enterprise is Damage. And anyone who's seen my channel before my coverage of Season 3, and I did a full-length review of this episode, will know this, because I love this episode to death. Now, this episode doesn't have that high of a rating on IMDb and other websites, and I thought maybe it was underrated, but then I realized it's actually polarizing, that some people really hate this episode because they think it goes against Gene Roddenberry's vision, blah, 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 whatever the fuck that means, because Archer does something evil. But that's why this episode's so good. That's why it really explores Archer's character, because to me, this episode is a combination of two of my favorite episodes. The Deep Space Nine episode and the Pale Moonlight and the Voyager episode, Year of Hell. And unlike Year of Hell, where there's a reset button at the end of that episode, there's no reset button here. All this damage, all this fucking trauma and destruction that happened to Enterprise, where it's falling apart around them and stuff exploding in their faces, that doesn't magically go away. That's something that they have to deal with for the rest of the season, and that is so much more interesting. Now, of course, it also deals with the In the Pale Moonlight story arc in a way where, because, in that episode, Sisko has to do something very immoral and something that really goes against his morals, because in order to save humanity, and that is the same thing that Archer does here. He basically raids and steals. He attacks another ship to steal their shit. Basically, the stuff doesn't belong to Archer at all. He's basically stealing their stuff because it's the only way they continue their mission, and they need to continue the mission to save humanity. And I think the build up to this decision was so good. Like that Ready Room scene where T'Pol goes to Archer, because of course T'Pol has her own thing going at this stage because she's suffering from withdrawals because she's been taking these drugs. But that scene where she goes in and confronts Archer, and she's basically saying in no uncertain terms, you cannot do this, you cannot attack. That scene, I broke it down in my review of this episode, just how masterfully written that scene was and how masterfully acted. Like, Scott Bakula and T'Pol, the actress who plays her, really outdid themselves in this scene. That scene was one of my favorite scenes of all of Star Trek, where T'Pol throws Archer's words back in his face, where he says, we can't save humanity without holding on to what makes us human. And he throws that off, but Archer tries to justify it. He sounds a lot like Captain Ransom, and from that Voyager episode of Equinox, where he's like, we have no choice, I have no choice, I have to do it. And T'Pol's like, no, bullshit, you don't have to do it. And Archer tries to justify, saying, no, we're not just stealing it, we'll leave them some supplies. But T'Pol, points out, but that's if everything goes rosy. Something could go wrong. You could destroy the ship. You could leave them incapable of defending themselves from other raiders. You could kill them all from a result of the damage you caused to their ship. And Archer's like, I'm sorry. Nothing we can do about it. And because you can tell how much he hates himself. And this is why I say how I love so much that we felt with the aftermath consequences and how much this bothered him later on and caused him trauma, because he hates himself for doing this. But he knows it has to be done as the captain. And so you have the T'Pol, because she's suffering from her own shit, her own withdrawals, where she just slams the pad down on the table, yells and screams at him, I won't let you do it. I mean, God damn it, that was so good. That was so intense. And then you have the actual scene where Enterprise goes and attacks this innocent ship of bystanders who were stopping to help them. And attacks them and steals their ship. And to see the alien guy who's played by Damar just be like, you are leaving us stranded here. Why are you doing this to us? And Archer just says weakly, we have no choice. You can tell how much trauma this will cause him. You can tell how much he hates himself for doing it. And that is powerful shit. This is such an amazing episode. I think it is the best of what Star Trek has to offer. Not saying it's the best episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, but it's up there. It is amongst the best of what Star Trek has to offer. It's definitely the best episode of Star Trek Enterprise. So there we go. That is it for my top 30 episodes, favorite episodes of Star Trek Enterprise. So this here concludes my coverage of Star Trek Enterprise. I will be, as I said, starting on my coverage of Star Trek The Next Generation next month. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I do many more Star Trek videos. I also cover other shows like Mr. Robot, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.